Hello, I'm Soycat, and if you like learning about geography and the world and stuff, then you've probably at some point had a question that seems like it should have a very simple answer, but if you try to ask people, they give you some long-winded reply that implies you should already know. This is called gatekeeping, and it really annoys me in any community, but particularly when it comes to the world of maps. You might not exactly know why it is that Spain and Portugal are separate, but be confused about it. You might not know why it is that so many countries share similar flags, despite not being similar countries, or why it is that there are so many giant landmasses that nobody lives on. This curiosity is enough to feed a trillion thumbnails, but instead of doing that, today I want to answer all of these questions in one place today, and so let's answer your obvious geography questions in a way that isn't going to imply you're stupid for not knowing. So let's start with the simplest one, because the moment I opened my first atlas at like age 11, I couldn't help but wonder, okay, Spain and France, obviously different countries, they're separated by mountains, but why, I can understand why these places are not the same, but I can't understand why Spain gets most of the Iberian Peninsula over here, but then Portugal is hanging out in the corner as a separate nation. Why are Spain and Portugal different countries? If you ask this question, the correct response is because, well, in Spain, mostly Spanish people live there, they have a very different economy, a very different setup, and they speak Spanish, whereas in Portugal, they speak Portuguese and indeed have their own political system set up, and the answer as to why Spain and Portugal aren't one country is because of that. And if you might even ask, like, okay, so why hasn't Spain invaded Portugal? And the answer would be like, well, because they respect human rights and you can't just invade your neighbors. But the fun question about why Spain hasn't absorbed Portugal kind of doesn't come down to the present day, but goes back to the past. Why are Spain and Portugal not one country? Because Spain never used to be one country. Spain was made up of a lot of different kingdoms. If you've ever heard of Henry VIII's wives, Catherine of Aragon is from Aragon, which is now a part of Spain. There is the Basque County, there's Catalonia. There are many different places that were their own kingdoms that eventually merged into Spain, and Portugal just never made the cut. Except actually it did. Here's a fun thing you might not know. If you look at a map of Europe, this is Europe in 1500 AD, you'll see that Spain has eventually unified into this big monarchy, but Portugal is its own separate thing. But if you look at 1600, you'll spot something interesting, which is that the two countries actually merged. This is really fun. Because the Portuguese king died without leaving an heir, it actually meant that the closest person who could take it over was Spain, and so at one point Spain and Portugal merged together, but this wasn't actually to the satisfaction of the Portuguese people. Here's the fun thing. Throughout history, and especially in Europe, people have found all sorts of reasons to unify and to divide each other, and in the case of Spain and Portugal, even when there was a proper official reason to do it, it didn't make the Portuguese, nobles in particular, I'll be honest, you can say the Portuguese people, but when you're talking about the 16, 17, 1800s, it's always the nobles, the upper classes in these countries, particularly when we talk about the US, but time for a story for a different time. Anyway, but when it comes to any European nation, the rich people weren't happy, and so they decided we should be independent again, and be independent again is exactly what Portugal did. But it's fun because if you look at any country across Europe, you'll find times where they've merged with their neighbors and kind of unmerged with them. Germany and Austria obviously happened about 100 years ago, and we all learned that we shouldn't let them do that again. But what's interesting is you can look at this same map of Europe from 1600, and you can, we can zoom into 1700 and be like, oh yeah, there's Poland, Lithuania, there's Denmark, Norway, there's England, Ireland, or as we called it, the United Kingdom. But yeah, all of these different, the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland, I believe. But you can see that the Austria-Hungary, there are so many cases of countries that merged together and countries that decided to split themselves up for what seemed like dumb reasons looking back. Like there are a bunch of Dutch people, most of them decided to be in the Netherlands, I believe the Protestant half of the country, but the Catholic half of the country decided to split off and form Belgium with some French or Walloon-speaking people. It's a very, very weird situation, but so many countries exist because of this desire to merge with people who are like you and to split away from the people who aren't. And even though Portuguese people and Spanish people could today see themselves as basically one whole, for 300 something years they haven't, and over that time they developed such a different culture that it's as silly as asking Canadians why they aren't a part of America. Although, I think that's a fascinating story by itself too, because, you know, why aren't Canadians a part of America? Funnily enough, the fact that, you know, everyone talks about, like, the original 13 colonies, but they leave out the fact that, like, oh yeah, Quebec existed, and so did Nova Scotia at the time. That was not Nova Scotia, this is Nova Scotia. It's a very interesting story that we'll have to skip aside, because that's the reason why Spain and Portugal aren't one country. Over time, there are so many different wars and so many different people movements that mean that, yeah, any country that looks like it logically should own its neighbor, probably has at some point wondered why it hasn't owned its neighbor, and probably has even tried to do that, and it hasn't gone well. Or it went well and then eventually stopped going well, like in the case of Spain and Portugal. Boom. Okay, easy first question. Why is Spain and Portugal not the same? Why are the US and Canada not the same? It's always the same answer of lots of people have probably assumed the exact same as you have, and one of the two sides, if not both of the two sides, eventually agreed it's for the best. It's like if you spend a lot of time with someone and everyone assumes like, oh, you two should start dating. And maybe you both look at each other and go, huh? And if one of you says no, the other one of you goes, yeah, I didn't want that either, actually. And so that's why Spanish and Portuguese people both pretend they don't want to date. Although, I do have a Portuguese friend, and she said, honestly, Portugal and Spain should be the same thing, but most Portuguese people and most Spanish people would not say that. Speaking of things that Portuguese people and Spanish people wouldn't say, they wouldn't say our flag looks similar, but if they were from one of these three countries, they would say that it is. Why do these three countries have similar flags? Well, these are the Arab colors. They are used in a lot of flags, and red, white, and black are all used by these people. There was a big movement in the, funnily enough, in the exact same vein, to unify all of the Arab countries together, and it picked up some steam. I think like Egypt and Yemen at one point merged together, but basically most of the Arab countries eventually agreed like, but we like ruling ourselves. It's kind of good, isn't it? They all had very different interests, and so there's a huge number of Arab countries that are unified in spirit, in flags, but not in interests. The same is true for these three countries using yellow, blue, and red. Although you can see Venezuela has the stars, and you can see Colombia has the big chunk at the top. The truth is that these are pan-South American colors. All of the countries in South America that all unified, all of the countries that got away from Spain, if we're being honest. Honestly, you can explain this in the same way you can explain Portugal. Being not Spanish is something to be proud of, and that unified countries for a while, so they have a lot of shared concepts. Simon Bolivar is a big political figure across all of the region. However, despite that being true, all the countries eventually got their own political independence, but they still have the same origin story, and therefore the same flags that come from that. So with that said, the next set of countries that are similar, Georgia and England, this is a really, really weird one on the surface. Why is England, not the United Kingdom to be clear, just the, bottom 50% of territory and, like 90% of population, why is it that England, this place, according to Google, has the same flag as this place? They are so far apart, literally opposite ends of Europe, and yet they have near identical looking flags. Well, the answer is that this isn't the English flag. I mean, it's the flag of England, but the iconography goes back further. Ultimately, you can just answer every question in here with history. This isn't the flag of England, it's the St. George Cross, and Georgia is named after St. George. So these two countries both believe in St. George. He is a historical figure that I was mind blown to learn as a 20-something-year-old that St. George is not just an imaginary figure that English people made up because we wanted to have a common tale. He's a real person, apparently. He didn't slay dragons, I'm pretty sure, but that's what he's famous for doing. And so St. George is the patron saint of England, and he's also the thing that Georgia is named after. Georgia likes him a little bit more, though, because we have one St. George's cross, and they have 5. What about Ireland and the Ivory Coast? These are really interesting flags, and this is one that I actually couldn't tell off the top of my head. I knew that specifically the Côte d'Ivoire flag, Ivory Coast, they insist on being called French in all official means, but they can't stop me. You can't force me to use French Ivory Coast. Am I dead naming Ivory Coast right now? Maybe I should feel bad. Anyway, but the interesting thing about the Ivory Coast is they use reverse Irish flag. Ireland's flag is obviously one you could just say, well, they made it up from their independent colours, but how is it that Ivory Coast landed on the exact opposite? Well, they didn't look at Ireland, and they don't have any connection to Ireland. Instead, it's the same thing, where they wanted to make a brand new flag. They could have used the Pan-African colours, green, yellow, and red, if I'm not mistaken, but instead they wanted something that was kind of similar to France. They came up with this flag design, but first of all, it looks a bit like Italy, and second of all, it was seen as too close to France. It's using 2 of their colors rather than, being a little bit of it. So instead, they went for orange, and the orange represents, you'll love this, the blood of those who fought for the freedom, and as a result, we have a country that has an accidental near Irish flag. Honestly, Most of these cases, New Zealand and Australia, yeah, they're both UK colonies and they're both in the south of the southern hemisphere. That little thing you see on there is called the Southern Cross. You'll see it whenever you're in this region of the world, and it's a really useful way to know where you are. And so they both have the Southern Cross. One is in black, one is in red. It's easy to spot which one is which if you see them side by side, but if you don't, oh, actually one is in white, one is in black. But interestingly, both countries have discussed changing their flags. Australia has argued they look like a boat club, or they look like all the other UK colonies. And New Zealand has argued, yeah, we actually do want a new flag, but they had a referendum that was so roughly held that even though everyone agreed they should change their flag, no one agreed on what they should change it to, and so New Zealand still looks like Australia, but that is going to change eventually. I am 100% sure in my lifetime, as sad as it is, because I love seeing Union Jacks all over the world. By the way, Hawaii has this lovely flag that is half UK, half US, because they were trading with both countries at one point. Absolutely delightful story. But I love seeing the Union Jack in the corner of any flag, as a proud patriot, of course. But I do have to still say that I think that it just is inevitable that Australia and New Zealand will eventually pick unique flags. If not one of them, then both of them. Speaking of things that one country will do, but both will not, let's now talk about the last case of similar flags, because Poland, Monaco, and Indonesia is such a weird one that I think can be simply put down to, oh yeah, countries used to have flags. These countries are so far apart that they probably wouldn't have seen each other's flags to know that they were so similar. I think that, you know, in the very earliest of days, like, yeah, Poland and Monaco would have been like, yeah, these flags aren't the same. And would Indonesia have known of Monaco's flag? And if they did, would they have thought about it? But I think the most interesting example is Chad and Romania. Chad definitely knew that Romania existed when they picked their flag, and they would have been able to, someone would have said, oh, are you going for the Romanian colors? So why did Chad pick the same colors as Romania for their flag when they went independent? The answer is that Romania used to have a flag that looked like this, and now instead it looks, because, you know, they were a communist country, whole fun thing, but when they stopped being a communist country, they removed the emblem, and now actually Romania picked a flag that's exactly like Chad. And so was that a smart decision? You actually have to blame Romania. Because, you know, in the case of like Ireland, Cote d'Ivoire, or, you know, in these cases, you can blame, you know, the more recent country, but Chad is the more recent country, but Romania changed their last. So why did Romania pick the same flag as Chad? You'd have to ask them, I guess. But the simplest answer is they already argued that was their flag before, and so isn't it fun? Anyway, there's a bunch of other countries that have similar flags, and that's because people are very lazy at designing them. Red, white, and blue is used everywhere. They're the pan-Slavic colors, and if you think about it, red, white, and blue is how you can be patriotic as an American, or as a British person, or as a Russian, or as a French person, or as a Dutch person. Literally, 4 of the 5 nuclear powers use the same colors, which means if you see red, white, and blue over a nuke, all you can be guaranteed is that those aren't Chinese weapons. So I guess if you see red, white, and blue on a nuke and you live in China, you should be fearful. Anyway, with that said, speaking of things to be fearful for, I mean, I guess also there are other nuclear-capable countries, but there's only 5 on the UN Permanent Security Council. Anyway, obvious geography question, number 3. Why is it that people all live in, like, you know, like, there's a lot of big cities, and they tend to be in very close by places. If you look at a population density map, you'll see that people tend to live in the same places. I think that it's really easy to focus on the red versus the brown here, you know, and say, oh, why is it that, like, people don't live in rural Spain? Or why is it that, you know, like, Western China is less populated than Eastern China? I think it really can be tempting to focus on that, but a lot of people also get focused on the idea of, like, why is it that there are so many parts of the world where no one lives? If you live in a big city, you'll have been told the lie before that there's just not enough land. You know, humans are going to run out of land so soon. And if you live in London, that feels true. Let me show you what it looks like. You know, where I went for breakfast this morning. If you look over here and you look up, you're like, yeah, there's no land. We are running out of places to build houses or flats. It's crazy. Every single space of land that looks like it can have apartments, it does have apartments. That's a big problem, right? So, yeah, if you live in a big city, that feels true. But if you live in the countryside, like even the UK, which is a ridiculously densely populated country, all you have to do is end up like somewhere like this. Let me show you a pub I went to in Luxborough. If you look at a place like this, you're like, oh, there's actually basically infinite land. We could set a whole city here, and then a whole city next to that, and then a whole city over here, and then a city over here, and over here, and over here. You could even just make small towns and we'd have so much more space. So why is it then, why don't we settle here? Because we don't need to. If you want to leave London, or leave, you know, the Cologne-Bonn region of Germany, or leave Moscow, or leave New York, you can move within your country and there's so much space. I think Americans and Canadians are particularly aware of this because they live in the second and third most highest land area countries. But like ultimately it's like, yeah, if you live in a giant country, you probably get that. But even in a tiny country, you probably wonder like, why don't the Danish like send some people inland, or at least why don't you properly populate a region like this? And outside of the idea that like actually it's Greenlandic people who live in Greenland, why are there no people in Greenland? Easy answer. Greenland is so empty, and everywhere on this map is so empty because people like water. Human beings are a carbon-based life form. I hope I got that right. We are a carbon-based life form, and so we need water to survive. Why is that the case? You'll have to ask a scientist, not a guy who likes talking about geography in front of a green screen. But instead, so you know, to prove how much we like water, really zoom in on this part of the map where you look at the red population in Egypt. Oh, that's the biggest river in the world and the biggest source of water for the African continent, and everyone lives by it because people need water to survive. Therefore, where do people not survive? Deserts. Sahara Desert, empty, besides a few little oases. The Australia, inland, where there's no water, empty. Greenland, oh, well, that's not a desert, Toy Cat. Ah, got you. It actually, at least a decent proportion of Greenland is. All of Antarctica is a desert, and all of Greenland is, which seems ridiculous when you look at a place that looks like this to call it a desert. Obviously, you're wrong, but it comes down to rainfall. Rainfall is the determinant of how much water comes from the sky, and in places where it's really cold, it doesn't come down as water, or it doesn't come down at all, and it doesn't need to. And so even though there's a lot of snow on the ground, which is a water byproduct, I guess you could argue, turning snow into drinkable water is a bit of a problem, and so as a result, most people don't live very well near places like this. If you want to have a great source of people, you need to have a great source of water because it's our number 1 survival point. And so even though there are all sorts of places where we've overcome problems like temperature, the hottest place in the world has people living there. The furthest away places from food in the world have people living there. I mean, like if you live in Iceland, you have to get so much of your food shipped in, but people can still live there. The same is true for Alaska and Hawaii, but people can still live there. We have so many needs, but the most fundamental one is water. Every single one of these trillion videos about why don't people live here, and I'm not being sarcastic when I say there's a trillion of them, every single one of these videos exists because humans need water to survive. We also need land. We need to be near other human beings to some extent to either buy their products or sell our products to them. But in general, yeah, people live where there is both water, arable land, so you got food covered, and other human beings, which is why this belt of India is covered in people, which is why this belt of Northwest Europe is covered in people. It's arable land, but it's also manufacturing that kind of coalesces. When you get everything humans need together, and there's already a bunch of humans there, humans will move there en masse. When you have none of the things that humans need to survive, humans aren't going to move there unless they are being very weird, or they have lived there for generations upon generations, and that explains what has happened in Greenland. It's a silly question, but an important one. So now the next question is, have you ever looked at the world and thought, you know, why don't Greenlandic people just drink this blue right here? Why is it that people from London have to drink from the Thames, where we don't anymore, by the way, but why do we drink from the Thames? Why do we drink from the river when we could just drink from the ocean? There's so much water in there, and the reason you can't drink ocean water is because it's salty, and salty water will kill you. Fun fact, by the way. I always used to assume as a kid, like, well, surely it would kill you eventually, but it actually kills you, like, it's better to die of thirst than to die of the, like, you will get less hydrated from drinking seawater than not drinking any water at all, which is, like, kind of counterintuitive to me. I would have guessed that you'd get the water effect first and the salt second, but no, don't drink salt water, you'll die. So if salt water is so bad, why does it cover 66% of the Earth? Well, you know, that's actually an interesting question, isn't it? But the point I want to answer today is, if 66% of the world is sea, does that mean that crime is legal if you go here? Have you ever heard of this idea that, like, oh yeah, there's a boat on the water where you can do all the crimes you like? Or have you ever wondered why it is that you shouldn't just rent a boat and then bring people upon it, because you know that they would have to do what you say because of the implication? Always Sunny references aside, I do think there's a really interesting point here about what happens if you commit a crime over here or over here, and the answer is actually kind of boring. I always wanted the answer to be like, yeah, crime is legal if you're at sea, But the actual answer, according to the UN territories on the matter, is basically the law of the sea has been signed by all of these nations. So if you are a Kazakhstani citizen, or you're near their territorial waters, they have so much of them, or indeed if you come from that one country that really doesn't like signing international treaties, what a surprise. But if you're from one of these countries, then there is a little bit of wiggle room, to be fair. But for most countries, the UNCLOS, UN Convention of Law on the Seas, was adopted in 1958 and basically agreed that there is such a thing as internal waters. These are waters that belong to a country. You own your rivers, you own your lakes, you own your ponds and everything else. But then there's archipelagic waters between your land masses. This is also yours. And then you own a certain distance out from your land. What's really fun about this is, if you've ever looked into this, the reason that there's such a thing as a territorial sea and the reason it's 3 kilometers is because that's the distance of a cannonball. I love this. I love how much of geography is explained by history. Have you ever wondered why the top of, I think it's Delaware. Have you wondered why the top of Delaware looks like this? It's because this is the distance you could fire a cannon from the top of a castle in Wilmington. Or I think it's Newcastle, actually, if I'm being honest. But it's the distance you could fire a cannon from was the boundary off Delaware, and that resulted in a perfectly circular border. Have you ever wondered why the Gambia looks like this? It's because the Gambia was entitled to all the land within a cannon shot off the river. And so when you measure that, you get a country that looks a lot like an intestine or something. But yeah, really, really fun stuff in my opinion. Cannonballs decide a shocking amount of history, including this fact right here: how much of your sea is yours. Then there's a contiguous zone, and then there's an exclusive economic zone where you own all the rights to things like oil or fish. And then there is what is called the high seas, which is not a place where you can just, actually, is it a place where you can do all of the marijuana you want without any issues whatsoever? Can you take mushrooms and anything you like there? Well, the answer is interesting, because the high sea is 60% of the world's oceans, and the jurisdiction there is interesting because effectively it's up to the International Seabed Authority. This is a UN organization that grants or denies the right to exploit the seabed, but, they belong to no state and are unprotected, and therefore have become the preferred theatre for many traffics. Any action taken must be carried out in blah, 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 blah. So who owns the high seas? Well, the UN. So what happens if you can make around there? Well, the UN covers it, but it's not really the right body for it. The UN, the UN body for the international seabed, I don't know how they would prosecute a murder, and so what really happens if you commit a crime at oceans is either, if you are in the UK, or many other countries, if you are a British citizen or a British subject of any form, when you commit a crime at sea, it's as if you committed it upon the shore. So if I murder someone at sea and I live stream it, or even if it just gets found out, they'll be like, hey, you murdered someone and you're British, therefore you're going to a British court to work out if you deserve to be murdered for your murder. I guess we don't murder people anymore. You deserve to be locked in a cell for your murder. And so what's interesting is many countries will do this, but the more effective regulation on it is that every single ship in the ocean, I'll try and show you this by going to the Suez Canal. I don't know where the Suez Canal is, what I'm learning right here. But if we go to the Suez Canal, you can see that every single ship, if we can get a nice zoom in on one, every single ship will actually have a tail fin on it. This tail fin, or a tail flag, which is the flag that represents what laws that country has to follow. Okay, I can't see the flag no matter how far I zoom in, but you have to trust me that every country has to sail a flag. There is no such thing as an unflagged vessel, and so if you if you are a ship owner, you have to pick a country to register your ship in the same way that you have to pick a country for your Google account or your car. Even though you can take your car into other countries and you can take your Google account into other countries, you have to pick a home country. Now, what's interesting is that most places will just pick what is called a flag of convenience. I believe Panama is the one that is most often used these days, but basically people will choose Panama as their flag of convenience because Panama says if you commit crimes at sea, we don't really care, to be totally honest with you. And so if you have a Panamanian registered ship, you don't have to worry about minimum wage laws or regulations on crew or any of those things, which is why cruise ships will use them. But what happens if there's a crime on one of these things? Well, it's kind of, it depends on the exact nature of it. But ultimately, if no one finds out, you won't get in trouble, but that's true on the land too. So what happens if you commit a crime at sea? It depends on the country that your vessel's flag is docked in, and if the country doesn't care, then you won't get in trouble. But then ultimately, like, you know, if you go to certain corrupt nations, I'm not going to name any, and you say, here is 10 million, I'm going to commit a crime, they might just let you. In fact, I think there was quite the controversy recently. In fact, yeah, let's find it right now. I think there was quite the controversy recently because of in the Bosnia war. You know, this is a tangent into the video. Tourists paid a bunch of money to go and shoot civilians in Bosnia in the 90s. How much money? This is a really interesting one, but at least 100,000 euros in today's terms. So murder is legal in Bosnia if you pay the Bosnian Serbs. So therefore, if you can pay the Bosnian Serbs 100,000 to shoot civilians in the 1990s too, this isn't even that distant a time, then you could probably pay lots of countries to kill people on land. And so if you've ever wondered to yourself, man, I want to get away with murder, but I have to go on the high seas and that's a nightmare, just find the right government and the right amount of money and you can go commit your crimes there easier. Speaking of committing crimes, let's go into the final question that I guess we asked at the start. Why don't countries just invade their neighbors? Well, actually they do. Russia invaded Ukraine. Saudi Arabia has supported the invasion in Yemen. That is, I think, fair to say. And lots of countries. Israel is quite famous for having a bit of land that is formerly owned by Syria. Countries invade their neighbors all of the time. And so why don't countries do it? They do. But why don't more countries do it? Like, why doesn't Germany just say, you know what? I would love a little bit of extra living area. Let's take Denmark. Let's just have it. Let's just go into Denmark and say, we'll have some of that, and then either kill all the Danish people, or ideally, negotiate with the Danish government, you're going to be a German province now, or a German state, as they call them. Well, the answer to that is that I think a lot of their neighbors would dislike them, but I think that we've done much worse in the past, and eventually, you know, it's Germany. You can't sanction Germany forever. Eventually, you'd have to get on good terms with them, so why don't countries do it? Honestly, the easiest answer is that it's actually very hard to, you know, taking over a country is a very, very messy thing, as Russia is seeing with Ukraine. If Russia wanted to take all of Ukraine, I think fundamentally it just wouldn't work. The bits of Ukraine that Russia has taken, I think starting with Crimea and now expanding to the east, are specifically the parts of Ukraine that have the most Russian sympathetic people. They already speak Russian. They already, you know, some of them yearn for the days of the USSR. It is very hard, you know, there are some people who live between countries. These are mostly on the borderlands of lots of places. But there are sometimes peoples like this that are invadable, and there are some countries that believe that it is worth the huge human cost and economic cost to prove that you can have bigger borders on a map. I'll be honest, the only major player doing that today is Russia. Russia has just taken a bit of Georgia, it's taken a bit of Ukraine, I'm sure it's going to take a bit of Moldova one day too. You know, it took a bit of Germany, and it's kept that bit of Germany over here. If you've ever wondered why Russia has a giant exclave, Russia is kind of good. Russia is the only country really doing that, and the costs have been so high that I think any rational person would not say it's worth it. In the far, far future, Russia might get away with, you know, keeping some bits of Ukraine and Georgia, and maybe in some sense that is actually a logical trade. But actually, the reason that countries don't invade each other is because it's really hard to take a country's population and make it yours. The UK, Ireland does not have a functional heavy military. The UK could invade Ireland anytime they want to. That's not like, I'm Irish, to be clear. I'm allowed to say things like that before any of you threaten to explode me. I'm allowed to make that joke too because I'm Irish. But the interesting thing here is that I think the UK could invade Ireland at any point, and the Irish people, you know, like, we would get a lot of backlash, and Ireland wouldn't be as economically productive as a part of the UK as it is as its independent country, and so it works better for both countries for there to be an international relationship. The same is true for Germany and Denmark. I think that there are some things you get from a country, but there is a lot of loss that you get from having to invade a country, and so most countries don't invade each other for that reason. If you have a especially also, I think the final layer is that democracies don't like invasions. I think something like 22% of the UK would just refuse to fight in any war ever, no matter what the circumstances. But especially if the war was invading, I would not want to. No matter what you said, no matter how you try to convince me that Ireland were the bad guys, you could not send me to the front lines of that war. I would not fight the Irish people. I think there are some number of people who would fight Russian people. I think there are some number of people who might fight to, you know, like help free, you know, Sudan or Yemen or whatever else. But these people are not fighting. I think it's quite famous actually that during World War II, I think maybe World War One also, but during the World Wars, a lot of people would specifically shoot above the enemy's heads because they're like, why are we even fighting? This seems very silly. As countries have moved towards democracy, the idea of invading each other has become ridiculous. And so even when the world's biggest military has a dispute with their neighbor, it is off the cards to invade. It is a very interesting thing, but democracies don't want to invade their neighbors. Democracies don't want to kill their citizens so they can gain more country, because although a totalitarian dictator, although other forms of government might have a person who thinks it's worth expending some of their people for the betterment of everyone in the long term, most democracies value their lives over the concept of a country's territory, and that's why Ireland hasn't invaded Iceland. That's why Denmark hasn't taken over Norway again, and that is why mostly world borders stay the same, except when a country splits from another one. It is very rare that a country invades its neighbor, annexes it, and that actually sticks. And I'm struggling to think about the last time it happened. I think you could make a case. No, yeah, I'm trying to. The last time that a country took over its neighbor and annexed it, and two countries became one, as opposed to one country becoming two, is you are talking about World War II, if I'm not mistaken, and that's kind of crazy, isn't it? Yeah, I'm racking my brains on this one, and I think that would be it. Speaking of that being it, did you know East Timor is, or Timor-Leste is two different words for the word East, so that's fun. But West Timor is actually part of Indonesia. That's just my fun fact for the day. With that said, I hope you all enjoyed this. You know, actually, just as a little freebie, because I know now that if I've spent so long thinking about countries that are that split from one into two, what countries are going to do that soon? Well, Sudan is in the middle of a war that looks like it might create a North and South Sudan, which is funny because there's already a South Sudan, so there might have to be South Sudan, or there's going to be a fun situation going on there. Sudan might split in two, but that's hopefully going to be averted if the civil war ends. Papua New Guinea is going to, the Solomon Islands. No, it is Papua New Guinea. I'm crazy. Papua New Guinea is going to split up Bougainville Island into its own territory. This island right here will gain independence. That's kind of exciting, I guess you could say. And yeah, there are lots of countries that are on their march to independence, and we'll have to see how that goes. The world has been heading to more and more countries, and so if you want to learn all the countries, you'd better do it now, because it's the easiest it will probably be in your lifetime. With that said, I hope you all enjoyed this second channel geography video. I hope it did answer some of your obvious questions about the world, and maybe some you didn't even have. And if it didn't, then you watched this long, so you make your own mistakes. This video sponsored, by the way, was the Earth. Have you ever considered you want to be somewhere, but Mars doesn't have enough oxygen and Mercury is too hot? Go settle on planet Earth. Make yourself a beautiful flag and make sure it doesn't look like your neighbors, and in 100 years, you might just be your own country. Earth. Use code TOYCAT to get 5% off your next subscription to Oxygen. That was a bad ad read. But second channel, don't care. Bye.